Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. It's Monday night. It is just about 9 o'clock here, Eastern Time in Lakewood, New Jersey. Welcome back. Nice to see everybody signing in. I do want to remind you, for those of you who have questions or comments, please use the raise your hand tab, the reactions button on the bottom of the screen, and just click raise your hand and we will take your questions. Nice to see everybody signing in. And for those of you who could turn on your video cameras, of course, we always appreciate that. And let's start another week. Thank you, Ilana, for turning on your video. Let's start another week of Mondays with Moshe. This week is a really exciting topic with a really exciting guest, and we are doing something different. This is an in-house, in-person guest. Dr. Lieberman traveled from miles and miles away, actually just a few offices over, and requested that he come in and do this interview live. Well, first of all, I want to just thank you, Dr. David Lieberman, for agreeing to do this show and giving us of your time, which is precious and valuable. So thank you.
My pleasure.
It's always nice, it's always nice to see that even the greatest people in the mental health community and the psychotherapy community are just willing to give back for the mental health professionals who spend our whole lives giving to others. So it's really beautiful, and it's a beautiful role model. So we appreciate that. David is an author of how many books?
13.
13 books. That's 13 more than me, or maybe 14 more than me. And
but in fairness, only a couple of them are actually good.
Yeah, well, I was about to say that I don't know how many of them are bestsellers, but quite a number of them are bestsellers. And it attests, I think, to the clarity, the precision and clarity and the way that you seem to connect with people's understanding and people's hearts. I've watched some of your interviews, some of your talks, and there's really something unique and special in them. And I'm hoping that tonight we can tackle the subject of self-esteem,
Sure.
and especially as it relates to the psychotherapy room, being that we're amongst a group of many, many mental health professionals. So let's start with some of the basics, if it's okay.
Sure.
I mean, do you want to first tell us who are you? How did you get into this field? And
That's a long story. Let's get into basics.
okay, we'll get to story time later.
Okay.
So, I guess one of the questions that I wonder is, how would you define self-esteem? Self-esteem is sometimes conflated or confused with self-confidence.
Right.
What is the difference, and what is self-esteem?
That's a great question. And there are a lot of, first off, if you Google it, you ask, now AI, you're going to get a different definition every time. And if you open up every book, you're going to get a different definition. The working definition I like, and again, it's far from exclusive, is self-esteem is the degree to which a person likes themselves and feels worthy of good things in life. Okay, so that's my working definition. Now, as you mentioned, self-esteem is often conflated with confidence. In confidence, and it's confused with a lot of things, but confidence refers to the degree to which I feel effective in a certain area or comfortable with a certain trait or characteristic. So, for example, I can have high self-esteem and still consider myself to be a lousy tennis player, which I happen to be. My confidence in my ability to play tennis is low, but my self-esteem is high. At the same time, I can have low self-esteem and high confidence in my intelligence, my appearance, in these pocket areas. Now, my ability to be effective in these areas or comfortable or confident in these traits may mirror self-esteem, but it's got no relationship to self-esteem. And what happens, by the way, is that you're going to find that a person who builds an identity around this one area that they're confident in is going to have a very volatile personality, because their whole self-image is wrapped up in this one thing.
So, okay, so let me just make sure I understand what I'm hearing you say. So confidence is a person's ability to perform. They trust that they can perform in a certain area, or that they're good at something.
Yes.
But that has nothing to do with the self-esteem, meaning if I feel about myself that I'm unworthy, undeserving, and I don't love myself, I still may recognize that I'm good at performing certain.
Right, true, which leads us, by the way, to the imposter syndrome, which is often misunderstood. People assume the imposter syndrome is when a person lacks confidence. It's not. It's when they lack self-esteem. Because if you genuinely lack confidence, you're not qualified. It's not imposter syndrome. You are an imposter. You're not you're not capable to do what you should be doing. But if you are capable, it's got nothing to do with confidence. It has to do with low self-esteem. So if I have a self-image of myself that's negative, I don't love who I am, I can be very, very talented in a certain area, but still not feel as if I deserve to be there, not because of a lack of skill or talent, but because of a lack of self-worth.
Okay, so you have a person who's confident. I'm just trying to create an image in my mind. You have a person who's confident, but he has poor self-esteem.
Okay.
So the way I imagine that manifesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the person, in order to feel the love for himself or experience the goodness of himself, he needs to flaunt, he needs to boast, he needs to push that area of, because he knows he's good at it, so he's got to rise to the top and be the best at it.
Right, exactly right, which is what's going to happen is when he shows up someplace where he is not, you know, in his element and he's not performing, you're going to notice he's going to become either very combative and bombastic or withdrawn, depending on, you know, different facets of his personality. But sure, if his entire identity is wrapped up in his ability to be effective in a certain area or confident with a certain trait or characteristic, when he doesn't measure up, his whole sense of self is now in flux. Whereas if you have somebody with higher self-esteem and they show up and they have a bad performance, or they realize that, you know what, they're not measuring up, their ability to still love themselves doesn't go away.
So the person with,
I'm sorry, let me just also say, this is by adults. By children, it's a little bit different. Children, the two are intermingled, because if you have a child who is effective and confident in a certain area or more than one area, it's more likely he's going to develop higher self-esteem than would, because self-esteem is gained differently by children than it is by adults. So the confidence and self-esteem is more interwoven by children than it is by us.
interesting. Now, I imagine that the influence of the self-esteem when it comes to a child is going to depend on whether the these pro-social behaviors that they're engaging in are encouraged or discouraged.
100%. And the basis, the foundation of most children's self-esteem is going to come from the relationship with their parent. And in a nutshell is that any child that grows up that's made to feel like an obligation, made to feel like a chore, made to feel like they're getting in the way of the parent's happiness, will have a very hard time feeling good about themselves. The reason is because children are by definition egocentric. The world revolves around them. So no child is going to say, wow, dad's having a hard day at work. He's going to come home, blow off some steam, yell at me, have a drink, you'll be fine. The child is going to internalize
It's all about me.
That's right. And say, what is so broken, bad, defective in me that is causing this treatment? So irrespective of how effective a child may be, which is why we see as you transition, or not a good word anymore, but as you know, people move to adulthood, they can have everything going. We look at people all the time, we think they've got everything under the sun going for them. Why do they hate themselves? And the reason, of course, unfortunately, is not to play the blame game, but their childhood clearly was missing something that they needed. Not that their parents were neglectful in any way, we can't assume that, but the parents didn't give the child what the child needed.
Right. And that's a very important distinction in and of itself. Sometimes you can have a child who's particularly needy, and the parents, you know, can't in any way meet those needs, which doesn't mean that the parents per se neglected them or.
Sure, and we know this because how many times do you hear parents say to you, I've got 6 kids, 7 kids, I've done the same thing with each child, and why is it that this one is, and it's because it's not that you did anything wrong. The child's needs were such that you are either unaware or incapable, not because of neglect, but because of either a lack of, you know, awareness or capability for you to give that child what they needed.
So let's talk a little bit about children and self-esteem, because I feel like there's such a wide array, you know, especially like you said, there are so many parents who are quote unquote good parents or good enough parents, and then we see one child who's really struggling. So a number of questions. I don't know if I should do them one at a time and I have to memorize them, or I should do them all at once and then you have to memorize them. Okay, so here's one question. Question number one is, are there children who are born with strong, healthy self-esteem? You sometimes see these kids who just have it together. They're the leader of the group. They're not mean. They're not narcissistic. They just seem to have that strong self-esteem.
100%.
How is that though? I mean,
so that actually ties in maybe to another question in terms of you know, the ability for a child and how maybe a parent should internalize, you know, how it is that their child, you know, hasn't, you know, followed on a path that they had hoped for, and that we all have what's called a tikkun, which is a rectification, a fixing of the neshama, of the soul, right? We're all here for a reason. If we weren't here for a reason, then, you know, we wouldn't be here. So we're all here to perfect ourselves. So we come into the world with different sensibilities, different sensitivities, and a psyche, that an emotional makeup and an environment that is going to optimize whatever it is that we need in order for us to, you know, to have that tikkun, to have that rectification, to put us on the right path, right? So our tikkun, we call tikkun, rectification, is synchronized to this thing called mazel, right? Mazel is, we often, you know, translate it in Hebrew as luck or good luck, which is someone a mazel tov, but really it's a confluence of factors in addition and conditions that allow for the tikkun to express itself. So a person that needs to go through a certain experience is going to come into the world with a certain genetic makeup, a certain emotional makeup, a certain environment, certain circumstances that, again, allow for the tikkun to express itself. So you will find, no doubt, you're going to find children that, about 10% of the population, by the way, are just wired more sensitive, a little more anxious even. And, you know, some come in as sort of like an alpha personality, much more take charge, and you see it out of the gate. You see it with small children. Some are much more timid, others, they're like that old weeble wobble. So absolutely, you have different emotional makeups right from the beginning, different temperaments, which develop into different personalities.
I guess what I'm struggling with is, without environmental input,
Yeah.
how is it possible to have a strong self-esteem? I mean, I would imagine a child's born with a kind of blank slate mind, and then there's environmental factors from which they learn about themselves. And why would I be born with self-love?
Good. So it's not so much you're born with self-love per se, but children, there's a temperament. Personality is going to be a confluence between the environment and that child's sort of temperament or nature, right? You've got that nature and nurture going together, which is why you can have two kids who grow up in the same environment and have completely different, the same experiences and have different interpretations and different ways of dealing with it, right? Different responses or reactions based on their personality. So you will find, in much the same way, you've got some people who are more extroverted, right? They're more risk oriented. Other people may be more introverted, less risk oriented. Other people may be more comfortable in a leadership role. Other people more in a submissive role. So, you know, these are all functions of the soul, which is going to express itself in the psyche.
Okay, so you're describing it in a very spiritual fashion. I think psychoanalysts would put it in a more psychological fashion, but I think the concept or the idea is the same. That said, I guess on the flip side, which was the next question I was going to ask you, is people who are born, let's say, with a more depressive temperament or tendencies towards depression naturally. So it's more difficult for them to perform. It's more difficult for them to garner evidence from the environment, whether it's through performance, you know, of tasks or performance of things that entail energy, or if you know the reciprocity from parent-child or from social reciprocity. You know, somebody who's presenting with a more depressive feature. So it's almost like a self-sabotaging cycle that causes their self-esteem to disintegrate, if I'm being clear.
Yeah, no, I think you're asking a very sharp, nuanced point. And I think it's good to remember that, you know, you see some kids and then adults who have, like, you know, I always tell parents, you know, you're going to have, if you got a number of kids, you're going to have that one kid that walks in, flips one shoe one way, one the other way, and they'll never see each other again. Yeah, the other child walks into the house, one shoe goes here, you're never going to get one child to appreciate the other's, you know, way of doing things. That's that. So you're going to have your children and adults, of course, who they think through, they may be overthinkers, over analytical, and so on. So that person interestingly enough, might be more prone to depression, not because they're born depressed, but rather they're used to thinking, they're used to analyzing. And the more impulsive, sort of happy-go-lucky personality, there are a lot of pluses, a lot of minuses to all personalities, but that child is very much forgive and forget. He's not going to always go so deep, and that child is not going to be prone to depression as much as the thinker will be. Now, that thinker doesn't have to be stuck in that depressive mode if he learns how to take that trait and to channel in a healthy direction. But you're right, the inclination for depression is going to manifest itself more in that type of personality than the other. Obviously, different personalities, but to draw the contrast.
Yeah, and so again, it's harboring, potentially harboring the destruction of self-esteem.
No doubt, of course. Yeah.
So I mean, I just want to remind all of you out there, for those of you who have questions or comments, so please use the reactions tab on the bottom right of the screen and click the raise your hand, and we'll see your hand raised and call on you. So please, by all means, feel free. Let's talk a little bit about psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy. As I'm listening to you talk, there's so much that seems to be attributed to nature. And when we sit, I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and we sit with clients or patients and we hear their stories, which oftentimes, their stories really just are comprised of it's one story comprised of many stories.
Right.
And we hear about parental neglect, family neglect. It wasn't fair, I wasn't taken care of properly. Is it fair to say that what we're working with very often, or perhaps most often, is perceptual? It's strictly perceptual, meaning the parents did in fact do the best that they can with their 5 children that they had. There wasn't a more favorite one or a better one or a more preferred one. And this child just couldn't feel it and couldn't sense it. And today, when they're presenting themselves in psychotherapy, they're saying, my parent didn't get me. My parent couldn't hold me properly.
Well, so I'll ask this as a question, and answering yours is, do you think it's fair to assume that it's a matter of perception where there may have been abject abuse or neglect or behavior that 99 out of 100 people or 100 out of 100 people might very well have interpreted, honestly so. And again, because if a child is entirely egocentric, you certainly have more children who are more resilient. So they're not going to be as bothered, and we see this all the time. They'll brush it off more easily, and their story is much less eye-focused. But even the most, the healthiest child, in some situations, I can't help but wonder, wouldn't it be right to assume that this was a bad situation, objectively so? Yeah. No?
I'm not sure I understand.
In other words, I'm not so sure that certainly perception is a big part of it, and a healthier perception, even seeing from the parents' perspective, meaning that let's assume that the abuse is objective and genuine. No doubt that their parents also had a lousy childhood, and the ability to be able to. But I'm not so sure I would be so quick to label this person as this is your perception, meaning that it's your reality, when in fact it is reality, period.
Yeah, okay, so you're talking about cases that are more overt kind of abuses or neglects, but sometimes it's nuanced. It's the child saying, I didn't feel my parents, they 100%. Weren't present enough, they weren't there enough.
Sure.
And I think part of why I'm just trying to think now as I process this, what's compelling me to ask this question is that there's so much beef against psychotherapy, at least for sure the old psychotherapy process, and a lot of it is stereotypically you're just blaming your parents. And I think it's again, I'm curious if it's reasonable to say that much of what people are bringing into the therapy room may be as a result of their unfixable challenges that they may have had, or you have, let's say, children who are extremely rigid by nature, and it's just, there's almost nothing the parents could do in some of these cases to make them happy and to please them. Or you have children who are depressed, and no matter how much the parent tries to hold them, they can never feel it.
True, 100%.
And so if we, one of the things I'm looking to, I guess, debunk or diffuse in this perception is that what we're looking to do is say the parents are wrong and the parents are bad. And that's what therapists are trying to do, or the conclusions that the clients come to. What's really happening is
Right.
something else that they're.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you walk that line, and I think you once again you bring up a very good point, is that empathy and validation is going to get the therapist very far, because up until the point that you validate a patient's experience, they're going to be fighting for it. Because they're not going to let their guard down until it's validated. So validation, though, has nothing to do with right and wrong. We're validating the fact that based on this person's perception, based on their experiences, right, this is how they see things, in which they are 100% entitled to. And so we're validating the fact that if you went through this with these glasses on, any reasonable person would be in pain, and that pain makes sense to me. That validation will now allow for you to be able to allow this person to see a different perspective. But again, they're not going to take off their glasses and put on yours while they're still holding tight to theirs.
That's right.
As soon as you validate their experience, you can do it in 10 minutes or 10 years.
Mhm.
But after the validation, they'll take their glasses off, and now they'll see, okay, let me see what the world looks like wearing someone else's glasses. But this is true, by the way, any relationship, any situation, we insist on trying to show someone our point of view. It could be our spouse, could be our kids, could be a friend, neighbor, whomever it is. But up until the point you say, I see why you're so upset. It makes sense to me why, but doesn't mean I agree with it, but it makes sense to me why, based on your perspective, this is causing you pain.
Mhm.
As soon as this person internalizes that message, you can now move forward with the conversation.
Yes. And I'd like to share with you something that I've shared here on the past, how I perceive the mechanism of validation to be effective. I think that when people are struggling with whatever experience they're struggling with, let's just say they're struggling with anxiety. So there's really two layers to it, or two levels. There's the anxiety itself,
Yeah.
and then there's the challenge or conflict that they have with the anxiety. So like, why am I anxious about this thing? I see other people don't seem to be anxious. What's wrong with me? When one is validated, what it does is it removes that second layer. It's saying, oh, I am understandable. I am normal. I do make sense. Now I can coexist with my anxiety and allow whatever happens to happen.
That's right.
So what validation is doing is it's essentially normalizing the person.
Very good. It's so true. And I always tell people that no one wants to see themselves as crazy. So no matter how out there the person's story is, no matter what's going on, when you help to ground a person, say, you know what, you've been through a lot. What you're experiencing, what you're feeling, your thoughts, they're perfectly normal. As a matter of fact, I tell people, if you weren't feeling this way, I'd be worried. Right. And then that you're right, because you've got that second layer of guilt and shame, which you now have to sort of peel away, and that validation just wipes it away.
That's
and
right.
You can deal with the issue.
And that's why when you and I are in a relationship and we're talking, when you feel heard by me or I feel heard by you, I can now move into the next phase, because until that happens,
That's right.
I'm still stuck in my shame. Like, wait a minute, you're not understanding me. I'm not sure that I make sense. It's maybe there's something wrong with me. You reflect back on what I said,
Yeah.
or you validate on my experience and
Yeah.
see how now suddenly I feel calmer and I can tune into you.
That's right. And we see how far someone will go to be validated. We just want to hear, okay, I get it. What you're experiencing makes sense. It's okay. You're not. It's not out of left field. And then you can have an entirely different conversation.
That's right. And if you're saying something, why are you saying it? Because you want to be heard. If you don't want to be heard, you wouldn't be saying it. So if I'm failing in hearing you, then we haven't begun the conversation yet.
Well said.
So now let's talk about validation and self-esteem.
Okay.
So we have we could talk about it in regular interpersonal relationships, but let's talk about it from the therapy room perspective. Validation, in the same vein, has to have an effect on self-esteem.
Right. So I would say like this. First is I think the twin components are going to be empathy and validation. And empathy is often confused with sympathy. Sympathy fosters disconnection. It's pretty much, wow, stinks to be you. But when you're talking to somebody, empathy is your pain is my pain. And as you well know, is the rapport between the therapist and the patient is everything. The modality is secondary. The methodology these are all important, but unless you have that relationship, you're not going to move anyone forward. So empathy is helping this person recognize that you're on the same wavelength with them. It's not coming out of left field. And validation, again, is that stamp of approval. It's your experience, it makes sense. How you're feeling is perfectly normal based on, whatever it is you're dealing with and so on. Ultimately, self-esteem is not something one of the top 10 questions I get is, how can I help to give my friend, neighbor, coworker, son, whatever, more self-esteem? You can't give anyone self-esteem. Self-esteem, by definition, is something that we acquire for ourselves. You can't, now, again, this is different from children versus adults. By an adult, we gain self-esteem from the quality of our choices. Anybody that wants to feel better about themselves by changing their circumstances, by changing a relationship, by changing something without changing their choices, it's going to be short-lived or not lived at all. Right? The only way to genuinely infuse self-esteem is by allowing this person to make healthier, more responsible choices. When you do that, what happens is that the self-esteem and the ego are inversely related. So the more self-esteem I have, the more genuinely I love myself, the smaller the ego. As my ego deflates, my perspective widens. It's the ego that blocks perspective. Perspective is synonymous with my ability to see, accept, and respond to my world. It is sanity, in a word. So if my self-esteem is small, my ego is going to engage to compensate for feelings of guilt, inferiority, shame, and so on. The ego blocks my ability to see clearly. I'm not seeing what is. That's what makes me neurotic, is I'm not seeing reality. I'm not talking to you. I'm busy projecting an image of what I'm not. So by being more responsible, again, in broad strokes here, I'm increasing self-esteem, decreasing the ego. My perspective now widens. I see reality. My relationship with my world is more accurate. This is the definition of mental health.
Oh, wow. Okay, that was a lot of information packed in a minute and a half. Let's try to break some of it down, at least the parts I followed. You're describing the development of self-esteem through making better choices.
Right.
And I was I guess, placing an argument that the development of self-esteem can also happen through validation. And then you said something about children and adults, and I'm curious whether that would be different. But tell me if you agree or disagree with this. If the therapist provides strong validation and empathy towards the client, so the sense, I'm just thinking, I'm the client, I have this deep sense of shame. I was dismissed as a child, I was criticized as a child, I was irrelevant as a child, inadequate as a child. And the therapist is taking me very seriously, listening to my story, being horrified from the horrific parts, being excited from the excited parts. And I'm really feeling relevant. I'm really feeling worthy. Would you argue that that is not the part of the development of self-esteem itself?
So yes and no. I cover my bases. It's like this. If you had 100 people line up at the door, all knock on the door and say, Moshe, you're amazing, Moshe, you're the best, Moshe, you're terrific, at the end of those 100 people, you would feel pretty good. After some period of time, that is going to right, it's going to wane, it's going to wear off. So, we can help somebody. In other words, if you have somebody who is very, very low self-esteem, they are just in the pits. If I care about you, I invest you, at some point, you're going to begin to say, you know what, maybe there's something to me. Maybe I am lovable, that Dave is spending so much time talking to me, giving me inspiration and investing in me. Maybe there's something to it. In which case, I can take that feeling, use that momentum, and now shift the trajectory of my choices. But ultimately, if I'm still sitting there wrapped up in a blanket of self-pity, and you're telling me that I'm worthwhile and validate what my experience is, it's going to come on, and then it's going to just fall away.
So the old experiences of worthlessness will just come back.
They are going to come back because I've got this record playing that I'm no good. Now you come along and you play a different record saying, now hold on a second. Your perception isn't really so accurate. You are worthwhile, you are a good person. I'm feeling okay, great, wonderful. But unless I take that and I now make better choices, I am now going to revert back to my 20, 30-year-old record over your 10-minute pep talk.
Right. So yeah, I guess essentially that's what narcissists are looking to do. They're constantly looking to milk the environment for approval, and they're never getting it because that's all they're looking for. So in other words, whatever behaviors it is that they may be doing that to be successful, that's just a means towards getting their approval, but it's the approval that counts. And I guess that's what you're essentially saying, that all they're looking to do is get that feel good, right? They're stroking their ego, they're getting the feel good, but the old narrative and the old depression from that negative narrative is still present.
But yeah, I think you're hitting on a very beautiful point, and that is, what is a narcissist? Someone who suffers with genuine narcissistic personality disorder is somebody whose ego is so engaged that the inside hollows out, and they're left with only an interest in sustaining an image. Right, that is what they are. So if you like me, I'm worthwhile. If you don't, I'm not. And they're very much, which is why they're consumed with image and perception, and they suffer, contrary to popular belief, with perverse low self-esteem. And as a consequence, as we said before, you've got a seesaw and inflated ego, which is the definition of narcissism. So yeah, they're going to be living in those pat on the back attaboys, but they're not going to take that and transform it into anything productive in terms of making better choices, because that's not their source of fuel. Their source of fuel comes clearly vis-a-vis the ego, not from the intrinsic self-esteem. And the ego, by the way, is my ego will be inflated when other people acknowledge how amazing and wonderful I am.
Mhm.
My self-esteem is not going to be affected. Right? In other words, my ego, they will give me a boost in terms of my ego, but I am not going to love myself more because someone else does. The contrary. How many times, can you tell someone you're amazing, and because of their own feelings of self-worth, it doesn't stick.
Right.
The only way it will stick is if they make different choices.
Right. At best, it's assuaging their fear and their terror.
Short-lived as it
Short-lived.
is, but yeah, right.
Mhm.
And the ego is very scared because it's entirely dependent. It has no natural fuel source. It survives based on you, based on them. So if they feed me, I'm nourished. If they don't, I'm starving.
Okay. So let's go back to the therapy room. For those of you who have questions, please just click the reactions tab. I can't see the chat box tonight, so click the reactions tab on the bottom, raise your hand, and we'll certainly take your question or comment. Well, I'm hearing you say something that if I'm not mistaken, is not consistent with what Carl Rogers would believe. I think he would believe that just the relationship itself is in and of itself a means towards developing a stronger, healthier person. But maybe there is something consistent here with Rogers, which is when that person, if we can provide that validation, that understanding, that holding environment, that positive regard or unconditional holding, a really deep understanding of the person, I think what you might be saying is that it creates its own impetus for a person to begin to change. And I'm wondering if that's true, or if it's true maybe more in some people than others. Some people, like you said, enjoy the victim, self-pitying.
Yeah. Well, they are ensconced in it because it's comfortable and it's a known, which is a whole beautiful box we can open up there in terms of why people stay stuck.
Mhm.
But no doubt, look, make no mistake that unconditional love and acceptance can be transformative for the person. Ultimately, if they don't make different choices as a vessel, if they're not going to be able to hold it. Right? In other words, it doesn't matter how many people line up to tell them you are an amazing human being. If I don't make a different choice, my ego, right, is fixed. My self-esteem is fixed. My ego will decrease by the quality of my choices. Mm-hmm. And investing in someone, caring about them, validating their experience and unconditional love and acceptance will put me in a better state to want to invest in me. But if I choose not to, I'm not going to be able to hold on to whatever it is you feed me.
So it basically, through the experience with the therapist, there seems to be an enabling process for the client to pull out of their, I guess egocentrism, or right, their state of self-pity, state of pain, state of shame, and to be able to, invest in something greater and beyond that,
Right.
because they're feeling, because of that. But I
That's
would
right.
imagine that there's a period of time, if that's not activated over the course of a certain period of time, they'll just fall back right back into where they are.
100%, and it's going to be critical because you need that this person has no internal fuel source,
Mhm.
right? So they're getting it from the therapist. So if the therapist genuinely, authentically, honestly connects and validates their experience and has a genuine caring for this person, she will begin to see themselves as valuable. Now I'm a valuable person, and we invest in what we find valuable. If you have something that you don't like very much, you're not going to invest in it. If you have, you spent money buying a car or a bicycle or an apartment, whatever it is, you're going to invest and care about it. Same thing with ourselves. If I don't love me, my motivation to invest in me is non-existent. If I love myself, I will want to invest in myself. Since I don't have a fuel source by me, I come to therapy, you tell me, hey, you know what? You're worthwhile. I begin to see that, I begin to feel this, and now I'm going to go ahead, make better choices, improve my relationships. That's what's going to move me forward.
Excellent. So I'm curious to hear from the mental health professionals if this is consistent with the way you understand mental health and the development of self-esteem. And then I do want to ask you what the mental health professional's role is in that transformation. But before we do, let's take a question from
Yaakov.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I want to know if I understand right. Does the doctor mean that if that bechira is the number one thing in self-esteem? Bechira?
Okay, so bechira is free will. It's the ability to be able to make good choices, and it is at the foundation of self-esteem. Yes. Now, what's important though to recognize is, as you may know, I wrote a book on bechira called How Free Will Works. Is that not everything is within the scope of our free will, right? In other words, just because we say that we are free-willed beings doesn't mean that we can do anything that we choose to do. There's some things that are outside the scope of that. So it's important, before we beat ourselves up or our patient, is to recognize that just because a person has intellectual clarity and knows right from wrong, knows what the right choice is, doesn't mean that they have the capacity to make it.
So how can you proceed in self-esteem when not everything is in the capacity?
Because there are going to be there are things within the scope of our bechira, our will, that will allow for us to move ourselves in a healthier direction. And as we cover more ground, as we begin to move in that direction, our capacity is going to expand. What I mean to say is that, for all of us, even the healthiest amongst us, we know generally what the right thing to do is in a relationship with our spouse, our children, at work with ourselves. And we don't always do it. And it's not because of a lack of knowledge, it's because of our own emotional stuff. So again, even the healthiest amongst us, except for me, even the healthiest amongst us has our stuff, meaning that just because a person is going to have clarity doesn't mean now that they're going to be able to magically jump to those heights and make those kinds of choices that are going to shift the trajectory of their lives. It will be a process for some, slower and faster than others.
Thank you very much.
David, so we have the mental health professional. He's and she is the one who's sitting here and listening and wondering, okay, so where does this leave me in the therapy room? I've created a very, very powerful holding environment for the client. They feel extremely safe with me, and they're sort of stagnating and really just reveling in the beauty of getting to talk about how much pain they're in and their past and how they were neglected and how things were in fear. And they're really perking up and feeling better. But not every client says, okay, let's move on. I want to get somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we define the role of the mental health professional in creating, if I can even say the word, behavior changes,
Sure.
More pro-social.
Yeah.
Where are we in
All right,
this
how do
process?
we move them forward? That's a good question. The first thing I think is to take a step back and ask ourselves, why is the patient not more eager, why don't they come in, and some will, of course, why don't they say, okay, I hear what you're saying, okay, let me roll up my sleeves, why aren't they saying that? And the answer is because it's scary. I have a personal narrative. I have a story I've told myself for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. This is who I am and why I am. Now you're coming along and you reorient my perspective, which shifts my personal narrative. My world is just shifted. I'm now seeing my world, myself, my relationships differently. That's scary. Now, I've got this whole new narrative, I have this whole new story. Who am I? How does my world now make sense? And now you want me to venture out into this cold unknown. It was very warm and comfortable to wrap myself in this blanket of self-pity and blame. This is who I am. This is my story. As you know, we consistently will choose unhappiness over uncertainty because the uncertainty, that fear, is exactly what the ego is scared of. So we all have an ego, it's just we have a physicality, we all have a body. So as long as my ego is alive and kicking, it is not going to embrace uncertainty, it's not going to embrace change, it's not going to embrace the unknown. Our job is to help the patient, the person, to feel the pleasure of the possibility of moving forward versus the pain of being where they are. And as soon as that pleasure of pain mechanism is shifted, where it's the possibilities of being and doing and enjoying different quality relationships and different quality life is tangible to me, I'll take my foot off of first base and go to second base. But otherwise, I'm still going to be holding on because the known is what I've always been known. It is my safe harbor.
Yeah.
So we have to help that person.
So would you say that the role of the mental health professional, would it be to explicitly coach the person forward, or would it be or would it be more implicit? Like, this is where we're at. I recognize how important, how valuable it is for you to stay in your safe space. What are your thoughts about it?
So again, I feel that sometimes you not only to be explicit, you need to give the person a good whack. You know, again, that's me, my style, it fits my personality, and it's not for everyone, by the way. No doubt, it's not everyone embraces that. You know, let's move forward here. It's your life, and I can be, I suppose, a little heavy-handed for some people's temperament and taste. Other people are going to respond better to that. I do think that based on your own style, your own personality, and the makeup of that person, you know, you need to weigh those out. But I'm going to tilt in the direction of let's get moving here, only because I know I'm fighting against inertia. I'm fighting against what has been, and that's an uphill battle. So as long as I leave the possibility open of being where you are, and assuming that we're going to be able to grow, even though you're not changing the quality of your life and your relationships, I think I'm not doing that person a service.
I think it's so you know, it's so much more complicated, depending on each person, each client or patient's profile, and where they're at in the given place in therapy, you know, at the given time. So it's like you have some people who are. It's just like when you have kids who misbehave. You have some kids who misbehave simply because they're just wise guys, and that's their nature, and they need a little you know, spanking, and they'll get into shape. And then you have others who are really struggling or really hurting. So it's like you know, timing is really of essence. And with some people we have to go slower, because if we push them too soon or too quickly, then we invalidate the experience that they have, that they need to stay stuck. And on the flip side, if we allow them to stay stuck for too long, then we invalidate their interest in moving forward.
True, but I think that because we have inertia working against us, they are already in this stuck mode. We have an obligation to try to pry them forward, or pry their stuckness more so than I think the typical therapist might. But again, it's you're right. It's not for every person.
It's case specific.
100% case specific. But once again, is I do think I am more of a proponent of being more
All right,
proactive.
I'm hearing you say that too many therapists take too much time.
Yeah,
I get it.
and it's I don't have the disposition, so it lends itself to my personality.
Yeah, okay.
But once again,
But I think we have to, it's the balance, we have to
sure.
create that balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, by the way, let me just say, I was thinking about this actually before, is that, when somebody comes to me, I look for, my job is how to get them up and out as quickly as possible. And my most favorite cases are the ones where I tell them they don't need therapy, meaning just, these are the issues. You don't need to spend however.
Yeah, that's heresy. You can't tell someone they don't need therapy. This is against our field. Okay.
But again, it is one of the most gratifying things when you can send someone on their way. And I'm just thinking about just a recent case where this person called me, thank God, they got married and they're doing great and so on. And he thought he was going to be in therapy because he had a bad divorce and all this stuff. And I said, you don't need therapy. Here's what happened. Are you okay with X, Y, Z? You recognize this. That's it. It's like, taking part of a mechanic and you realize, you just needed to tighten a bolt.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the best.
Yes, those aren't the real psychotherapy cases.
Those are not
the challenging
the
cases.
the typical ones, right?
Right. Okay. Any questions from the audience or comments about self-esteem, about therapy, psychotherapy? Here we have one. Go ahead. If you can turn on your video, that would be great. If not, you can just unmute yourself.
Hi. So I joined late, so it could be like I missed some things, but I'm just trying to understand, like, were you saying that the way to build self-esteem is by like making good choices?
The way to build self-esteem, yes, is by the quality of our choices. Ultimately, we can get as much inspiration and enthusiasm and pats on the back from other people, but unless we make more responsible choices, we're not going to feel better about ourselves. And we know this just, empirically from our own lives. When we do something that is irresponsible, that guilt and shame is going to chip away at our self-esteem. We just like ourselves less. Now, of course, depending on the magnitude of what it is and our overall self-esteem, it's going to depend on how much it gets injured. But when we make better quality choices, we simply infuse ourselves with more self-esteem.
Like, let's say you're not unsure what to choose. Like, should you just go with anything and that way you'll learn from your mistakes? Like, it's just about like taking action.
Right, that's a very good question. So it depends on what the issue is. If you're somebody who procrastinates a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, then yeah, in other words, the responsible choice here is to make a choice, because we learn from experience, and experience is going to come from good and bad choices. And sometimes we don't, I tell my kids all the time, they ask me, should I do this or that? I said, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a Navi, I'm not a prophet. So, you may not have all the information, but at least you'll have more information after you make the decision, even if it's wrong, than before. Obviously, we're not talking about being reckless. We're not talking about being irresponsible. But sometimes a responsible thing to do is to make a decision in spite of having all the information, because we rarely have everything we need. And again, if you're one of those personalities that maybe a perfectionist needs to dot your I's, cross your T's before you cross the street, then your job is simply to make a decision. And win, lose, or draw, it's going to be a win. And the proof of that is you will feel better about yourself after you make the decision, even if it doesn't turn out the way you had hoped for.
One of the things I always like to say is that there's very little besides values. Putting aside values, or if you're a believer in religious practices, what's right and wrong, there's very little that we can do that's either right or wrong. It's a matter of what consequences emanate from each decision we make. So we could often have to make a choice, and whichever choice we make is going to have some consequences that we'll be happy and pleased with, and others that we won't. And it's with both choices that we make. And we have to be able to make a choice, knowing the consequences, so to the best of our knowledge, and then proceed with it without looking back and saying, well, if I would have done the other way, if I would have sent my child to the other school, I wouldn't have had these negative consequences, because you also wouldn't have had the positive consequences. So it's there's very little that's dependent on the right choice or the wrong choice. It's most often just what are the consequences of the choice I make? So here's a question. In your approach with being that explicit with clients, what do you do when you face resistance? So you're pushing me, you're saying, Moshe, I have faith in you. I see you're a good guy. You're intelligent. You can get it. You can do it. You have some anxieties and don't want to get it done. Here's a little nudge. Go ahead and do it.
Right.
I come back and I say, Doc, you don't understand. It's like, you're making it sound so simple. I can't do it, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So good. So first, I don't push in a way that is going to generate overt resistance, because my pushing is, it's like this. Let's say you go into a restaurant, or someone goes into a restaurant and they want a nice table. So they give the maitre d' $50 and they say, if there's anything you could do, I'd appreciate it. Why not go over to the maitre d' and say, here's $50 bribe, please give me the next table. It's the same thing. And the reason, of course, is because the maitre d' wants to see himself as a good guy that does favors for patrons of the restaurant, and as a courtesy, they reward him monetarily. He doesn't think to himself, I'm going to be getting a lot of bribe, even though it's the same thing. So when you want to push somebody forward, you want to be sure that you are implicit in your explicitness, meaning that, the pushing should be like they feel like it's coming from them, even though it's coming from you. That's what I mean. I'm not talking about telling somebody, what are you doing? Not to say that I haven't done this, but more like, you're such a good person. You're trying to do all the right things here. And I would float it like this. For example, one of the things I would say, and the language is very important. I'd say, I'm wondering. I float things up like trial balloons, like in sales. You always ask. Sometimes you don't ask for the order. You don't say, do you want to buy this? You say things like, are you looking for, for early delivery or late delivery? Now, if the person's not ready to make a decision, you're going to find that out, but you're not going to get a hard pushback. So I'd say something like, I'm not wondering if, you were able to have a short conversation with your father, if that would make a difference to things. Now, by floating these things, whatever it is, I'm going to be able to gauge their resistance and know how to push. So I'm really going to hit them where they're going to come back and say no to me. I don't want no, I don't want that sharp resistance, but I am going to keep on pounding in all these ways that allow for them to get the idea that it's time to move forward. Does that make sense?
I think, let me just make sure I understand, because it's kind of answering a question that I always struggle with, towards behavioral therapists or behaviorists, is that there's something paradoxically deeply invalidating when you push somebody to do something which they're resisting. So I come into therapy and I say, I want to develop public speaking confidence. I have terrible anxiety to get up and speak publicly. I'm at the stage where I'm going to have to do it. I have bar mitzvahs and whatnot, and I just have terrible anxiety, and I can't do it. And then the behaviorist goes ahead and brings in behavioral interventions and says, okay, you can do this, you can do that, you can use exposure. This will expose them.
Yeah.
But the challenge is that they're giving me great ideas, but I'm also terrified.
100%.
And so I'm gonna resist by, my first initial resistance is, you're not getting it. I know I'm telling you that I want to get over my public speaking anxiety, but I also don't, because I'm so terrified.
Of course.
And so I think what you're presenting is a sort of different way of exploring, if you may, different possibilities. Would it be helpful if or what about the thought of, have you ever tried, and things like that? Is that more the idea of it?
It is, and that's one vein of approach. But I can't tell you how many times when I'll tell somebody, let's say that was wronged by somebody, but I know that they need to repair this relationship. I would tell the person, you know what? If I were you, I don't think I could make that phone call. I don't think I could. I mean, it was just whatever. And I'd be honest in that. I'm a big fan of authenticity, and I would validate that, say, I don't think so. Having said that, I wish I could have the courage to do it, because I really do here. Now, what am I doing here? I'm validating their experience in its entirety. I'm letting them know that this is hard, this is painful. At the same time, it's going to move them forward in a healthy direction.
So you're also presenting an alternative, or at least an alternative thought. You're implanting that they can do something else, even if it seems impossible. Is that what you're saying?
Well, sure. Yes, And also that, it's, and again, this is just one of the veins of the approaches, but if I want somebody to do something, there's nothing wrong. In other words, if you come to me and you want to learn to be a good public speaker, I say, what's the big deal? You get up, it's fight, flight, or freeze response, you get over. That is highly invalidating. And the truth is, any other than a sociopath, it is nerve-wracking to get up to speak before a big crowd. I shouldn't say it like that. There are people who can do it with more ease. But I'm a big fan, by the way, of responsibly sharing my own experiences. Yeah, self-disclosure. If it is responsible, it's very valuable because I build rapport, I show humility, I connect, I validate your experience, which is again why I will often tell somebody, if I don't know if I could take the advice that I'm giving you, but I do know if I could, I'd be better off if I were in your situation. Right now, they obviously have the choice to make. At the same time, recognize they're not letting me down. They're not letting themselves down. I don't tell some people sometimes. I know this is sometimes shalom bias. I'll say, with marriage, I'll say I have a hard time saying these words to you because I know I can only imagine how hard it is, but I can tell you, if you were to do this, you'd have a different relationship with your spouse. Right? Now, again, no, they're not at fault. They're not to blame. They're not trying hard enough. They don't do it. I'm setting it up genuinely so that this is a tough ask. At the same time, I know it'll help them.
So that's something softer than making a direct suggestion, in which if they can't accomplish it, they feel like a failure.
And not a failure, but they're mad at me.
Or they're mad at you.
Which
if they do it wrong, then they're mad at you. If they fail, then they're
right. Now,
also
mad at the therapist, we're big boys, we can take someone to be mad at us. The problem, of course, is we're injuring our rapport, right? In other words, I want to make sure that nobody feels like they're letting me down. They don't want to let you down.
Absolutely.
Right? So if I'm asking them to do something overtly and they tell me I can't do this, I have to be very quick to be able to allow them to recover from that and to put something else on the table that I will be able to say, that's tremendous, that's amazing. Because people move forward from positivity. You can't beat someone up who's been beaten up and expect them to move forward.
That's what I was going to say about the disappointment. Is again, one of my concerns always with strong behavioral interventions is that if they come back and they failed at the intervention, they disappointed their father again, and then it's all back. It's doubling down
100%.
On the shame.
100%. Everybody in the healthiest of relationships move forward from positivity, not from beating them up.
Okay, let's take a question from Shandy. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. I had a question. I was wondering, is it possible to change natures? Let's say you don't want to be like a deep thinker, you want to become the opposite, or you want to become a fun person, and without, let's say, some people drink or take things to become light and
right,
fun.
Right. So I think you're asking a very good question. The answer is you don't want to change your nature. Your nature is there for your good and for your growth. The question you want to ask yourself is, how can I channel my nature in a way that allows me to optimize my life and my relationships, right? So if you're a deep thinker, I certainly wouldn't highly recommend meditation, some sort of relaxation, a host of breathing exercises, different cognitive behavioral techniques, things to allow yourself to be able to still the mind, to relax the mind, but to become somebody that you're not, I'm not so sure that's a worthwhile pursuit. Because there are a lot of pluses that go with all of our temperaments, all of our natures. Again, we want to be able to channel it in the healthiest positive direction, because that will allow for we mentioned before, our tikkun, our purpose here, and really our passion to express itself. But when you talk about, shifting your nature, you're really talking about quashing who you are rather than bringing it out. Are there some times maybe you do want to quash? Possibly, but I would say it's far and away the exception than the rule.
I'm listening to Shandy's question, and I'm envisioning somebody who's watching people have fun, and they're sort of more reserved, And so they're using substances or
Yeah.
other means to be able to bring that part of themselves out. Now, if they can't, if they're craving that fun, they're craving that socialization, and they can't get it because they're so inhibited, would somehow becoming less inhibited be considered changing themselves, or is that?
No, of course. No, look, there are natural inhibitions that we have. People have that bar at different levels.
Yes.
Some people are very inhibited, other people less so. But to be able to move yourself to less inhibited, in other words, if you like who you are, and more importantly, the people around you like who you are more when you drink, I'm not saying you should drink, I'm saying that that is a litmus test that you may need to loosen your inhibitions, right? If you loosen your inhibitions and people don't like who you are, then clearly you want to rein them in more. So the fact that somebody wants to be less inhibited, then by all means, there are plenty of things that they can do, obviously without introduction of pharmaceuticals or alcohol, anything like that, to allow their natural inhibitions to be a little bit looser. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing, because there are aspects of our nature that have become unhealthy, not because it's how we were born, but because that's how we dealt with our environment. So if you have a certain temperament growing up and you don't have an ideal childhood, which few people have, right, you're going to develop unhealthy habits, coping mechanisms, right? And one of them may be, I'm going to be very standoffish, I'm going to be inhibited, I'm going to keep my distance. Now that was developed not because it's your nature, but because your nature expressed itself in this unhealthy direction in order to satisfy whatever challenges you were meeting with, but they're no longer necessary. So we hold on to these old coping mechanisms when they're not serving us well now. Those we can jettison for sure.
Because
Thank you. I like the last point.
yes. I want to ask you a question that I just thought about it. Perhaps, in today's day, it's one of the most important questions that I've ever thought of.
Where are my books available for sale? You're gonna add that, that's the big one, I'm kidding.
That was it.
That was the biggest question.
Yeah,
Right?
where are they available? So they're
I
on
find
all over.
bookstores everywhere.
Anywhere. You type in David J. Lieberman, right? And you'll come up with all 13 of them, and then some. This is perhaps, I think, one of the most challenging questions, and I'm wondering if there's anything to say on it. It's in particular to our community. Is there something called communal or community self-esteem or macro self-esteem that we, our community, it's probably not only our community, but it's the community that I'm familiar with and know, seems to just be struggling with communal self-esteem issues. It's about the Joneses. What are the Joneses doing? I have to be like everybody else. My individuality has to be quashed completely and squelched. I have to look like everybody, and I have to look like the best of everybody. It's become, if I may say, just absurd. Is there a concept of changing, developing community self-esteem or communal, or I don't know if you have a better label for it,
Yeah.
and how can we do that?
Right. So you're asking again a very good question. There's lots of questions in there. The first is we have what's called identification self-esteem, right? You have somebody who joins a fraternity in college, right? They join the fraternity, they identify with the fraternity. A person can identify with a certain sect, a certain religion, a certain ideology, a certain philosophy. You say, I identify with people who are, who recycle. I recycle with vegetarians, whatever it is. My identity is fused with this ideology or philosophy, whether or not it's healthy, a different conversation. And my feelings of self-worth can be enhanced. So that's one thing. So when you're a part of a culture, a society, a fraternity, how many people, are like, reservists or in the army and
Part of a synagogue, part of a synagogue,
That's right.
school, a temple.
That's right. So, much as look at a sports team, it's a good example. I'm not a sports guy, but if you talk to any sports person, it'll always be my team won, but it's the team lost or the team lost. In other words, when the team wins, we identify as my team won versus the team lost. We're very quick to be a part of something that's working out well, but we reject that. As a matter of fact, I know I mentioned glibly, but my most recent book called Mind Reader focuses on field called psycholinguistics. It's the language that people use and self-esteem and how we see ourselves and how to understand people based on the words that they use in their language and sentence structure and so on. So I just, it's top of my mind in terms of how we identify. So you can tell a lot by how people, you walk into a company, you walk into, again, like a synagogue, person says, this is my synagogue, this is my rabbi, versus this is the synagogue, this is the company. When we use I, me, my pronouns that identify our, it says that we want to be a part of it. And when we don't, it says that there's a division, which is just interesting in terms of speaking to patients. You'll learn a lot about how they see their relationships by the language that they use. And to answer your question is, yeah, if you're a part of a group that's not doing well, it can wear on your feelings of self-worth if it wasn't so healthy to begin with. Why do people join cults? Again, obviously not bringing up cults, nothing to do with religion, but sometimes they are part and parcel, is because I don't have much of an identity myself. I'm not thrilled with, life itself. So I identify with this, and now I'm going to infuse my feelings of self-worth, or excuse me, my feelings of self-worth are going to be infused from this,
the group energy.
That's right, the group energy, ideology, its philosophy, its leaders. I'm now a part of something bigger, something better, and so on. So if you're a part of something that's rocking and doing well, you will feel better, depending on, again, your overall level of self-esteem to begin with. And if you're part of something that's not doing well, that identification can injure your self-esteem. But make no mistake, the more self-esteem I have, the less of an impact it's going to have on me. The lower my self-esteem, vis-a-vis the ego, the more I'm going to attach, which is why people who are ego-oriented become very upset when you don't embrace their philosophy, their ideology, their synagogue, their friends, their favorite flavor ice cream. Everything is going to revolve around the ego and the egocentricity. So the more self-esteem a person has, the less they need and the less tied in they are to the image of whatever it is they identify with.
Okay. Let's take a question. I'm not sure if I got my answer fully,
Okay, so
but let's take a question first from someone who's identifying as SL. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I have a quick question. First of all, I find this fascinating. Thank you so much. But I think here's my question. It's something that bothered me for a long time. It's basically, we have this talk of self-esteem and self-confidence, but in Judaism, we have the concept of anivos. Moshe was an of Mikol Adam. I've heard stories of Rabbanim who, to the real extreme. I heard a story once about a rabbi who was on a boat and someone urinated on him. It was his most proud moment in his whole life because he wasn't upset about that. So how does that tie in to self-esteem, especially since we grow up with this in school, like you should be humble, etc.?
Okay, it's a beautiful question. I'm going to give you the short answer, okay? Because if you want the long one, we can do that also.
It's a book.
It's a book. So it's like this. Humility, a humble person, is synonymous with self-esteem. Arrogance is synonymous with the ego. A manifestation of the ego is arrogance, which if you brought up Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses was the humblest of men, right? He didn't suffer with low self-esteem. Someone like Korach, someone like Bilam, someone, the bad guys in the Torah, they were completely egocentric and as de facto are going to be arrogant. A person who, again, just look at the math here. I have high self-esteem, which means my ego shrinks. Small ego now allows for me to have humility. Humility doesn't mean I'm worthless. It means I recognize my greatness. At the same time, I recognize that everything I have is a gift from God, right? So my being great, which is why Reb Noach Weinberg, a blessed memory, used to say, take pleasure in your accomplishments, not pride. Pride is, look what I did, you take God out of the equation. So real humility is recognizing my strength, and it comes from a place of incredible self-esteem. Arrogance, in contrast, somebody who believes that they are, that the world revolves around them, suffers with very low self-esteem and is entirely egocentric. Now, egocentricity splits off. Not everyone comes across as that person who is overly confident, full of bravado, and aggressive and assertive. You have what's called the dented doormat, or sort of that people pleaser personality. This is somebody with low self-esteem and a dented ego. Now, on the surface, this person can look very much like someone who's very humble, but they don't give as much as they allow themselves to be robbed. And I always tell people, if you can't say no, then you can't say yes. Real giving is when I can say yes, I can say no, I choose to give. But if you're walking in a bad area and somebody says, "Can I have your watch?" They're not really asking you a question. You can't really say, "It's my grandfather's, I'd rather not," right? You don't feel like you can say no. So on the surface, somebody who doesn't feel like they have a sense of self is not going to be able to give. A real humble person is going to be able to say yes, able to say no, and choose when it's responsible. Somebody who suffers with low self-esteem will either not give, they're entirely takers, or they'll allow themselves to be robbed, and they're those perpetual people pleasers. And this is where it gets a little thorny and goes off into a couple of directions, which I don't know if Moshe wants to spend too much time on, but suffice it to say is that humility is genuine humility is an indication of strong emotional health and self-esteem. A person who is arrogant or a person who cannot stand up for themselves and draw proper boundaries, that is indicative of low self-esteem and an arrogance and egocentricity that just manifests itself in a different way. I hopefully that answered your question, at least somewhat.
Yes, it did. Thank you. So does that mean that someone who has good self-esteem is not always assertive?
Beautiful, excellent. It's like this. High self-esteem means that I'm going to be responsible, whatever that means, however it manifests. Sometimes the responsible thing is to give, other times it's not to. Sometimes it's to say yes, sometimes to say no. But my answer, my response will be a response, not a reaction. It's going to be based on what the right thing is, not because I can't say no, and I want to assuage feelings of guilt or inadequacy, or I am not going to give because I am not a giver and I'm not a good person, or I'm unable to give, I'm able to enjoy that reciprocity. So the answer to your question is yes. Sometimes self-esteem will mean that I'm going to give, other times not. But what it always means is I'm going to have that acuity, that clarity on what's responsible, and then act accordingly. It's not going to be an ego-based reaction.
I think in psychological terms, we call them vulnerable narcissists, or what may be also known as dependent personality disorder. In a lot of dependent personality disorder, it's like the only way that I can feel good is if I get acknowledgement or acceptance from other people.
That's right, and you'll notice that the surrogate, the counterfeit to connection with all personality disorders is control. Because I don't feel I can genuinely connect with you because I'm not worthy. Why would you love and accept someone that's so unworthy? So I've got to please control. That's right. That's right. Now, how do I maintain control? For some personalities, it'll mean by take you and be aggressive. That's right. Others, it's going to be I'm going to bend over, acquiesce, whatever you want, no problem. I'll maintain that connection because my deepest fear is rejection.
That's right. That's right. So I want to just finish up with that. Back to that last question, you had made the point of basically being connected to a successful group or being connected to a maladaptive or malfunctioning group, right? Again, as a group or as a community or as a society, is there a way for us to cultivate group self-esteem? Is there an answer to that question?
I'm sorry, I hear the question. I don't know.
Okay.
I love the question. I don't know. My suspicion it would be is the same way that each individual builds self-esteem is being more responsible. If we collectively were more responsible, I think we would have a identification now with some entity that has more esteem in it. But barring that,
we essentially need a community therapist or a community coach to lead us to a path of making better choices, of people spending what they can afford to spend, of people living to the standards that they can afford to live, of people living to standards that may be lower than others.
Right, but you know that this is, I don't want to say an impossible sell, but it's very hard. And when you understand this, the individual psyche, it makes perfect sense, because if my self-esteem is based on what other people think of me vis-a-vis the ego, my kids have to be the best dressed, whether I can afford it or not. If I'm image conscious, unfortunately, relationships are going to suffer because I'm going to send my child to a school not that what's in their best interest, but because of appearance. They're going to look and dress a certain way, not because of who they are and how they want to identify, but because what are people going to think about me? Ultimately, it's the parents' own lack of self-esteem that can injure their ability to give their child what the child needs. Not just comes up in shidduchim and dating all the time, right?
Yeah, sure.
I want my child to marry somebody who people will say, wow, look at me.
So interesting you're saying that. Just last night, somebody told me that when their first child started dating, their husband went to the matchmakers, the shadchan, and said, "I'm looking for a husband for my daughter, not for a son-in-law for myself."
Beautiful.
I thought that was great.
As a good, solid perspective. Very nice.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I was hoping we would get an answer to like, is there a community, group-based
I'm not
way to
that
change
good,
that
Moshe.
self-esteem?
You know,
And
again,
you're saying it comes down to the individuals.
individual, right? I mean, think about it. If
Individuals.
individuals all made more responsible choices as a collective, we would be on a different level.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight and for giving of your time and gracing us and making a new friend.
Likewise, the questions were just sharp, and hopefully people enjoyed the conversation and got something from it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Sure.
Okay. Good night.
So, good night,
We'll see you all
everybody.
next
Thank you.
week.
Thank you.